I think the expectations on business, on people, on individuals to act ethically is just increasing. So the standards, the bar for all of us has risen. My name's Dale Tweedie. I'm a senior lecturer here at Macquarie University. I started life as an accountant at PricewaterhouseCoopers, or Coopers & Lybrand as it was 20 years ago when I started work. And while I was doing my studies, I very quickly became fascinated by ethics and professional ethics in particular, and I ended up doing my doctoral study in philosophy, looking particularly at ethics in the workplace. If you think firstly about the role of accountants in society, I think one of the really interesting features of the role of not just accounting but all professions when it comes to ethics is that the survival and flourishing of those professions depends on being trusted by the community, and that trust can be given, but it can also be taken away. And one of the slides I always like to show my students when I start teaching ethics is the study of trust in particular professions over the last 50 years. And one that really stands out is people's attitude towards bank managers. So in the 1970s, bank managers were trusted by about 2/3 of the population, so held in very high esteem in the community. If you track to about 2017, 2018, that's fallen to 1/3, so basically halved over that period. Now, I'm not trying to pick on bank managers in particular. There's a range of reasons why that's happened, but I think that very dramatically shows the way that the trust that people have in the professions isn't a given that can be taken for granted. It has to be earned. I think sometimes when we think about what goes wrong, when you see corporate scandals in the news or whatever it is you think there's a rotten apple or a bad egg or somebody who comes into a company with the wrong ideals and goes on to act in ways that harm the company and others in the community and whatever it is. In at least a sizable number of cases, what happens is that people act unethically because they didn't actually realize they were in an ethical dilemma. So they didn't make an ethical decision because they didn't realize there was an ethical decision to make. So a psychologist, Tim Brunzell, calls this ethical fading. So the idea is that the ethical colors of a situation become bleached out, so that you think only in business terms when you should be thinking in terms of values, of commitments, of principles. So one of the things we're trying to do then in education, ethics education in a business context, is to, yes, recognize business purposes and goals, but give people a chance to really bring their commitments, their ethical values into their thinking in a very clear and explicit way, and in Tim Brunzell's sense, to bring the ethical colours back. As the climate crisis intensifies, we're going to see increasing pressures on business to do their part. As technology becomes more complicated, it's creating a whole host of ethical dramas and dilemmas that just didn't exist before. So when I started work 20 years ago, it was just when email had arrived. We're doing very basic accounting on spreadsheets, and if you fast forward to now and you look at some of the ethical crisis that is unfolding now around data security, around privacy, around the use of information, these issues just didn't exist 20 years ago. I think the last point to think about also, though, is the need for kind of ethical leadership. So on one hand, there's certain ethical issues that I think regulation is required to resolve. And certainly if you look at the raft of concerns that came out of the Banking and Finance Royal Commission, that there's a number of issues there that you can certainly argue, and I would argue, need stronger regulation to deal with. We also have to recognise the limits of regulation. And one small example I think is quite insightful is a very famous study about a childcare centre that had a difficulty with parents who kept picking up their kids too late. So in order to solve that problem, they decided to implement a fine, a penalty for parents who picked up their kids after the designated time. And the really interesting finding of that study is that actually the number of parents arriving late got higher rather than lower. And what happened there? Well, the traditional interpretation of that is that parents were originally seeing picking up their kids on time as an ethical demand, that they owed that responsibility to the childcare workers to let them go home, etc. As soon as they put a fine on it, as soon as you made it a penalty, people started thinking that almost as like a business transaction. If I want to pick up my kids late, I just pay the fine and then I can go on doing what I'm doing. We can't solve ethical issues just by creating a transactional model where businesses solely view ethics in terms of a cost-benefit analysis or whatever it is. And again, if you think of the case of accounting, I think what's special about accountants in a business environment is they're not just there to serve business interests. They're very clearly there with an overriding obligation to serve the public interest. So I think there's always going to be a space for ethical leadership in a business environment. And I think professions and professionals, like accountants in particular, have a really excellent role and are really well placed to provide at least some of that leadership.